My name is Anusha. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this beautiful event. Before starting, I'd like to say I request you all to switch off your mobile phones or at least put it on silent because, as you know, this auditorium, MS Subbalakshmi Auditorium, is designed for mic-less performances. The only microphones we use here are for recording purposes. So please switch off your mobile phones and try to not make any noise. So to begin, on behalf of ACJ, I'd like to say that we are happy to be collaborating for the program this event with South Asian Symphony Foundation, which is a not-for-profit trust founded by retired Indian civil servants Nirupama and Sudhagar Rao in Bangalore in 2018. Ms. Nirupama Rao was India's Foreign Secretary, and Mr. Sudhagar Rao was Chief Secretary of Karnataka. The purpose and mission of the trust is to promote dialogue, mutual understanding, and harmony among the people of South Asia, especially between India and our South Asian neighbors. The South Asian Symphony Foundation Trust utilizes music as a medium to promote its mission of peace. In the process, it has built a community of musicians of Indian and South Asian origin drawn from across the region and the world to create the South Asian Symphony Orchestra. As you all know, we have a symphony lecture by Sugata Bose Mr. Sugata Bose before the concert, and it is my honor to introduce him to each and every one of you. Sugata Bose is a Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University. He has served as Director of Graduate Studies in History at Harvard and as the Founding Director of Harvard South Asian Institute. Prior to take up the Gardiner Chair at Harvard University in 2001, Bose was a Fellow of St. Catherine's College, University of Cambridge, and Professor of History and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Bose was educated at Presidency College, Calcutta, and the University of Cambridge, where he obtained his PhD. His scholarship has contributed to a deeper understanding of colonial and post-colonial political economy, the relation between rural and urban domains, inter-regional arenas of travel, trade and imagination across the Indian Ocean, and Indian ethical discourses, political philosophy, and economic thought. His book includes Agrarian Bengal, Economy, Social Structure and Politics of 1986, Peasant Labor and Colonial Capital 1993, Modern South Asia, History, Culture, Political Economy, 100 Horizons, the Indian Ocean in the Age of Global Empire, and Nation as Mother and Other Visions of Nationhood. A volume of essays jointly edited with Aisha Jalal titled Oceanic Islam, Muslim Universalism, and European Imperialism has been published in 2020. He is currently writing a book on Asia after Europe and is General Editor of Cambridge History of the Indian Ocean. In 2015, he was awarded the Rabindra Puraskar, the highest literary award of Bengal. Sugata Bose is the chairperson of Netaji Research Bureau, Kolkata, where he has supported the efforts of his late parents Dilip Kumar Roy and Krishna Bose to preserve and disseminate the best legacy of India's freedom struggle and continues that work. He has jointly with Dilip Kumar Bose edited the 12-volume collected works of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. He is joint editor with Krishna Bose of Rabindranath Tagore's Purabi, the East in its feminine gender, translations of Tagore's poetry by Charu C. Chowdhury, and translator of Tagore's songs in his book Tagore, The World Voyager. He has made 3 highly regarded documentary films. Sugata Bose served as a member of parliament in India elected to the 16th Lok Sabha, representing the Jadavpur constituency in Bengal, and throughout that period as a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. His eloquent speeches in Parliament were widely heard and appreciated. I'd like to welcome Mr. Sugata Bose to the stage to receive a token of love and gratitude on behalf of all of us, and then to give us the symphony lecture. So I'd like to welcome Satwiki Sanjay and Taranpreet Singh to hand over a bouquet and ponada to the speaker. Everyone, please give a round of applause.
Ama Sometimes you have sung of dawn, sometimes of night, of tears and laughter, soul's pain and delight. In our sphere of strife, you brought the message of music's harmony. These beautiful lines, composed by Dilip Kumar Roy, in an ode to Sister Shubhalakshmi, capture the essence of the aspiration of the South Asian Symphony to bring music's harmony to our sphere of strife. I am honored to have been invited by Nirupama Rao to deliver the symphony lecture, and in what better venue to do so than this auditorium of the Asian College of Journalism, named after the non-parile M.S. Subbalakshmi. Dhanodhanno Pushpobhara, sung in duet by Dilip Kumar Roy and Shubhalakshmi, which you were hearing strains of as we started the program, was composed by Dilip's father, Dijendralal Roy, and had been immensely popular during the Swadeshi movement of 1905 in Bengal. I grew up playing the 78 RPM record of this song over and over again on a Grundig machine in my maternal grandparents' home. On the other side of the record was their brilliant duet performance of Bande Mataram. Dijendralal had set the melody of Dhanodhanno in the Raga Kedara, or rather Misra Kedara, while drawing on elements of European music in which he was well versed. Conservatives were naturally aghast at his creative assimilation of tunes and rhythms of the West in his music, including his patriotic songs. He was defended on this score by none other than Rabindranath Tagore. Some wish to banish Dijendralal from the domain of Indian music, Tagore wrote, because his songs have the influence of European melodies. If Dijendralal has awakened Indian music with the touch of the European golden wand, then Saraswati will surely bless him. Years later, in 1953, Dilip would have occasion to bless his father's memory when, facing a large and diverse global audience in San Francisco, he captivated them by opening his performance with a rendition of Dhanodhanno. Three creative borrowings from European music were evident in some of Dijendralal's Bengali songs. First, the introduction of straight notes or passages between direct notes. Second, the crescendo of chorus lines at the end of each verse. And third, the dramatic movement from one octave to another, as in expressing the emotional intensity of the devotion to Janmabhoomi in Dhanodhanno. Let me try to present to you in an amateur voice the final verse of Dhanodhanno. Bhair maer ato sneho, bhair maer ato sneho, kothay gele pabe keho, O ma tomar charon duti bokhe amar dhori, mago tomar charon duti bokhe amar dhori, amar ei deshete janmo jeno ei deshete mori. এমন দেশটি কোথাও খুঁজে পাবে না কো তুমি, সকল দেশের রানী সেজে আমার জন্মভূমি, সেজে আমার জন্মভূমি, সেজে আমার জন্মভূমি। Dijendralal inserted this song into his historical drama, Shah Jahan, which premiered in Calcutta's iconic Minerva Theatre in the heady days of the Swadeshi movement, when the Rajput queen Mahamaya asked her young choir to sing Dhanodhanno, the ode to the best country in the universe easily transported the playwright's audiences from the arid deserts of Rajputana to the lush plains of Bengal. The same European melodic features are evident in Dijendralal's song Bongo Amar Janani Amar, albeit now based on a different raga, Misra Jhinjhit, composed at the instance of the famous scientist Jagadish Chandra Bose. This song lent fresh vigor to the tumult against Curzon's partition of Bengal. Here is its final verse, offering hope in the midst of despair. যদিও মাতর দিব্য আলোকে ঘেরে আছে আজ আঁধার ঘোর, কেটে যাবে মেঘ নবীন গরিমা, ভাতিবে আবার ললাটে তোর। আমরা ঘুচাবো মা তোর কালিমা, হৃদয় রক্ত করিয়া শেষ। দেবী আমার সাধনা আমার, স্বর্গ আমার আমার দেশ। দেবী আমার সাধনা আমার, স্বর্গ আমার আমার দেশ। কিসের দুঃখ কিসের দৈন্য, কিসের লজ্জা কিসের ক্লেশ, সপ্ত কোটি মিলিত কণ্ঠে ডাকে যখন আমার দেশ। Dilip Kumar Roy felt no difficulty in rendering Bongo Amar as O My India in his English version. In the age of a Dijendralal or a Subramania Bharati, musical evocations of regional patriotisms of the Bengali or Tamil assortments could be generously offered in support of the cause of an Indian nation in the making. Dilip Kumar Roy can serve as a good guide to an exploration of the vast terrain of music and freedom, along with its border-crossing possibilities. Ever since they met in 1913 as first-year undergraduates in Calcutta's Presidency College, Dilip forged a lifelong friendship with Subhash Chandra Bose. In 1919, both went to Cambridge, where Subhash read philosophy and Dilip took the mathematics tripos. Since mathematics and music shared an intimate relationship, Dilip also studied and passed an examination in European music. From Cambridge, Dilip traveled to France, Italy, and Germany. In France, he studied Baroque harmony. In Italy, he was impressed by the rich tenor of Beniamino Gigli, who had been giving voice to Mephistopheles at La Scala, conducted by Arturo Toscanini. And in Germany, he was taken by Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata and the songs of Franz Schubert, especially Aufenthalt in the Rauschender Strom series. Among the many European savants he befriended was Romarola, who organized Dilip's discourses on Indian music in Lugano. On his return to India, he delved back into the Indian classical tradition and interacted with a range of maestros, including Bhatkhande, Abdul Karim, Fayaz Khan, Hafiz Ali Khan, and his own relative, Surendranath Majumdar. His European studies had convinced him that Indian classical music was in desperate need of forging a deeper relationship with literature. This quest served as the background to the fascinating conversations on music between Dilip and Rabindranath that began in the mid-1920s and continued until the late 1930s. Their alap in this Jugalbandi began in Shantiniketan on March 29, 1925. Both were skeptical of the truism that the language of music is universal, even though they were open to border-crossing conversations. Citing the ability to appreciate the imagery in Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, Rabindranath felt that through the long study, Indians had entered the outer door of English literature, but still required effort to cross the threshold of European music. Present at one of their musical meetings was the composer Atul Prasad Sen, whose Uthago Bharata Lokhi had been set to a tune heard on a gondola in Venice. The following year, Tagore said to Romarola, "I have always felt the immense power of your European music. I love Beethoven and also Bach. I must confess, it takes a good deal of time to understand and thoroughly appreciate the idiom of your music." In 1930, he would tell Albert Einstein, "Our own music touches me more deeply by its fundamental lyrical appeal. European music is epic in character. It has a broad background and is Gothic in its structure." Tagore was, of course, fully aware of the variations within these large constellations. He believed that in pure instrumental music, Bengal had not accomplished as much as Hindustan. While Rabindranath and Dilip broadly agreed on their assessment of Hindustani music, they differed on the optimal balance between poetry and melody in modern Bengal. While acknowledging the imperative of learning and appreciating Hindustani music, Tagore insisted on the distinctive trajectory of the development of Bengali music. The uniqueness lay in the devotional kirtan of Bengal. The ecstasy flowing from kirtan was not that of undiluted music in Tagore's view, but rather a joy blended with poetic rasa. The melody, however sophisticated, played a supportive role in enhancing the articulation of poetry. Dilip pleaded with Rabindranath to give the singer freedom to introduce variations in the melodies of the poet's compositions. If our songs had been harmonized and always sung like the Europeans following a written score, Dilip argued, Tagore might have had a chance of preserving the authenticity of his own tunes. In the absence of such a tradition, the poet's strictures merely constrained the self-expression of genuine artists. At the close of the first round of their exchanges, Tagore was prepared to let Dilip try and assimilate Hindustani music with the distinctiveness of Bengal to craft a fine balance. At the same time as Dilip was having his conversations with Rabindranath, he was corresponding with his friend Subhash, who was a prisoner in Mandalay. "The time is out of joint," Subhash wrote on October 9th, 1925. He urged Dilip to flood the country with songs and recapture for life the spontaneous joy we have forfeited. "He who has no music in his composition," he wrote, "whose heart is dead to music, is unlikely to achieve anything great in life." He had been captivated by the Gombhira music and dance of the Malda district of northern Bengal. Subhash asked Dilip to give a boost to the simple and spontaneous folk music of Bengal. From the point of view of folk music and folk dance, he added, "Burma is a marvelous country." After having mastered the different idioms of our Indian music, he urged his friend, "You may as well study the Burmese. It may not be an evolved art, but its capacity to delight the illiterate poor has somehow appealed to me." Dilip sent this letter from Subhash to Rabindranath Tagore. "Subhash has written a very fine letter," the poet said in reply. "I was gratified to know about the qualities of his head and heart through the letter. What Subhash has said about art is unexceptionable." Subhash's love of music was a key element in his many human and humane qualities. From time to time, he wrote to his sister-in-law Bibhabati from jail, "I miss scent and music." If man is regarded as a being possessing a soul, music is as much a necessity as food and drink, he claimed, while demanding the right to play musical instruments in prison from the governor of Burma. I sometimes feel he mused in another letter to the master of fiction, Sharath Chandra Chattopadhyay, as if Rabindranath expressed the emotions of a prisoner when he wrote, Shonar Bangla, Ami Tomaye Bhalobashi. Even though he transcribed this song and Tagore's O Amar Desher Mati in a prison notebook, his favorites extended well beyond the patriotic oeuvre to include 4 love songs by Dijendra Lal, 2 kirtans, and a Vidyapati bhajan, Kaha Jibana Dhano Brindavana Prano, Kaha Meri Hridaya Ki Raja. Subhash believed that the songs of Qazi Nazrul Islam, the revolutionary poet laureate of Bengal, had been enriched by the composer's lived experience of the colonial prison. After his release from Mandalay, he taught some of Nazrul's songs, including Kararoi Louha Kapat, Bhenge Phel Korre Lopat, to his young nephews and nieces. My father, Shishir Kumar Bose, writes in his memoirs that his uncle organized musical soirees to raise funds for the freedom struggle and humanitarian causes. He describes a wonderful scene in the late 1920s of a big concert in Calcutta's University Institute Hall with Subhash Chandra Bose, Qazi Nazrul Islam, and Dilip Kumar Roy adorning the stage. Nazrul performed his famous song, Durgamogiri Kantaramoru Dustaro Parabaro He, swaying a gong to accompany himself. Dilip entranced the audience with his popular rendition of Ranga Jaba Ke Dilo Tor Paye, a devotional poem to the Divine Mother Kali. Years later, Shishir sang the patriotic songs of Nazrul and Dijendra Lal as he drove back in his Wanderer car from Gomo to Calcutta after seeing off his Ranga Kaka Babu on his great escape of January 1941, and later in solitary confinement as a prisoner in the Lahore fort in 1944. Netaji himself taught Nazrul's Durgamogiri to the women leaders of the Rani of Jhansi regiment in 1943. Durgamogiri kantar moru dustaro parabar he lunghite habe ratri nishite jatrira hushiyar. The most poignant line in this song, in today's context, of course, is Hindu naora Muslim oi jiggashe konjon kandari bolo dubiche manush shantan mormar. In 1928, Dilip Kumar Roy joined Sri Aurobindo's ashram in Pondicherry, while Subhash was in and out of prison in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. When news came in 1929 of the death of Jotin Das in Lahore jail after a 2-month-long hunger strike, Rabindranath composed what was perhaps his finest song on sacrificial patriotism, Sharbo Kharbo Tare Dahe Tabo Krodho Daho. All meanness is devoured by the fire of your anger. O God, give us strength. Have mercy on your devotees. Sweep away, Almighty, what is false and petty. May death be dwarfed by the ecstasy of life. By churning the depths of suffering will be found immortality. Those who fear death will be freed of their terror. Your resplendent, scorching power will melt and let flow, freed of the chain of stones, a stream of sacrifice. Jotin's funeral procession in Calcutta was led by Subhash Chandra Bose. Once his own health deteriorated in prison between 1930 and 1932, he was exiled to Europe in February 1933. In his role as India's spokesman abroad between 1933 and 1936, Subhash was ably supported by a few European friends. One of them, Hedy Fulop-Miller, was a well-known Hungarian opera singer who had been introduced to Subhash by none other than Dilip. She visited India and stayed as a guest of Sharath Chandra Bose in 1936. Her recital for the Calcutta station of the All India Radio one evening led music critics to say that European music of such high quality had rarely been broadcast. during his internment in Kurseong during the latter half of 1936, we find Subhash writing to Emily Schenkel in Vienna asking for recommendations of good recordings of European music. Once Subhash was released from jail and internment in 1937, the old friends Subhash and Dilip had an emotional reunion in Calcutta, and the music of freedom once again resonated in the two Bose houses on Elgin Road and at Woodburn Park. The Bose brothers would listen to Dilip's patriotic songs with tears flowing down their cheeks. During the All India Congress Committee meeting and its aftermath in October and November 1937, Mahatma Gandhi lived in Sharat Chandra Bose's Woodburn Park home. His prayer meetings were held on the terrace of the large mansion. The music at these prayer meetings, Shishir Kumar Bose notes, was not limited to Ramdhun. Patriotic and other devotional songs were sung too, most stirring when Dilip Kumar Roy sang them. He also sang prayers in English. One evening, he sang Henry Francis Light's Abide With Me, and Gandhiji was deeply moved. The serene atmosphere he created by his music can hardly be described. Accompanying Dilip was the young music sensation Uma Bose, whom Gandhi hailed as the Nightingale of India. Another evening, after Gandhi's prayer meeting, the famous tribal Chhau dance of Seraikella, Odisha, was performed. It looked as if our terrace might collapse, Shishir writes, under the impact of so many dancing feet. It was at the AICC meeting in Calcutta that it was resolved, after consultations among Rabindranath Tagore, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Subhash Chandra Bose, that henceforth only the first half of Bande Mataram, extolling the natural beauty of the country, would be performed at national meetings. When the Mahatma fell very ill with high blood pressure, an anxious Gurudev came to see him. A frail Rabindranath was carried upstairs in a chair by Sharat Chandra Bose, Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, and Mahadev Desai to meet the ailing Gandhi. The late 1930s also witnessed the climax of the long drawn-out conversations about music between Rabindranath and Dilip, who was delighted that the poet seemed to have changed his mind about the musician's freedom of improvisation in relation to the tunes of his own songs. During conversations in 1938, Rabindranath explained that he liked Dilip's translation of improvisation as Shuro Bihar, which would help talented artists. His reservation had nothing to do with the principle, but rather its application. How much liberty should I give, and to whom? These were the questions. He would give the Pratibhaban, those endowed with talent, freedom unreservedly. If the average singer sought the same degree of liberty, he would have to say no. He was genuinely happy with the expression in Dilip's rendition of He Khonikeer Otithi, which he had sung in his own style while preserving the song's melodic structure. As the struggle for freedom reached its climactic phase, Subhash Chandra Bose was keen to be ready with India's national anthem, even before independence had been won. Abid Hassan describes an animated discussion at the Free India Center in Europe about 3 shortlisted songs: Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Bande Mataram, Muhammad Iqbal's Sare Jahan Se Acha Ye Hindustan Hamara, and Rabindranath Tagore's Janagana Mana Adhinayaka Jaya He. Netaji chose Janagana Mana as India's national anthem, a choice that would be ratified after independence. An elaborate orchestration of the song was done. On September 11, 1942, at the inauguration of the Deutsche Indische Gesellschaft, the Hamburg Radio Orchestra played the music of Tagore's Janagana Mana as India's national anthem for the first time. In 1971, my mother, Krishna Bose, on her European journey in search of history, found the bill for the orchestration of Janagana Mana in the archives of Hamburg's Rathaus. It had cost 750 marks. A recording exists of this landmark performance. Subhash Chandra Bose spoke about poetry and philosophy with references to Goethe, Schopenhauer, Rückert, Schlegel, Max Müller, and Deussen, while recalling Tagore's visit to Germany in 1926. Janagana Mana was again played as the national anthem by the Berlin Radio Orchestra on Independence Day, January 26, 1943, at Netaji's final public appearance in Europe before his epic submarine voyage to Asia. The song, which greeted the light of Asia on his arrival in Singapore on July 2, 1943, had a distinctly European, or more specifically Scottish influence in its tune. Composed by the lyricist Mumtaz Hussain of Lalpur, Punjab, it was an early indication of the musical prowess of India's Army of Liberation. सुभाष जी वो जान हिंद आ गए है नाज जिस पे हिंद को वो शान हिंद आ गए सुभाष जी वो जान हिंद आ गए है नाज जिस पे हिंद को वो शान हिंद आ गए खुशी का दौर आ गया निशात बन के छा गया एशिया का आफताब एशिया में आ गया सुभाष जी. On the eve of the proclamation of the Azad Hind government on October 21st, 1943, a Hindustani version of Tagore's Janagana Mana was produced by Netaji, Abid Hassan, and Mumtaz Hussain. When I sent the original notation written down in 1943 from the archives of the Netaji Research Bureau, the Carnatic music maestro T.M. Krishna noticed a few interesting variations from the score created by Direndranath Tagore for Janagana Mana. The Azad Hind anthem, Subha Sukha Chayanaki, would have been sung between 1943 and 1945, not only by martial voices of soldiers from India's north, but a multitude of civilian voices who had rallied to Netaji's call of total mobilization from the subcontinent's south. On Netaji's 125th birth anniversary, on January 23, 2022, we were delighted to close the traditional birthday assembly at Netaji Bhavan with a beautiful rendition of the song following the 1943 notation by a dozen of T.M. Krishna's students. And I'm grateful to Gopal Krishna Gandhi, who's present here, for putting me in touch with Krishna. The INA Orchestra, conducted by Ram Singh, created a very large repertoire of stirring songs whose melodies were drawn from diverse sources. In addition to the famous Kadam Kadam Badhaya Ja and Hum Dehli Dehli Jayenge, a Gurkhali song was based on a popular Japanese tune. The celebration of India's national greeting that Netaji gave to his country took the form of a qawwali. Azad Hind Sena ne jab Netaji ka पैगाम लिया आजाद हिंद सेना ने जब नेताजी का पैगाम लिया जय हिंद का नारा गूंज उठा हाथों में तिरंगा थाम लिया जय हिंद का नारा गूंज उठा हाथों में तिरंगा थाम लिया जय हिंद का नारा गूंज उठा हाथों में तिरंगा थाम लिया. And so on. Apparently it used to be sung in messes where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs and Christians would all gather together in Singapore and Rangoon. Abid Hassan was fond of telling us the story of Netaji's visit to the Chettiar temple in Singapore in October 1943. He had turned away the head priest saying, "What? Come to your temple where even Hindus of other castes are not permitted entry, not to speak of members of other communities who are equally near and dear to me?" He agreed to go when the high priest returned with an invitation to an Indian national demonstration. He went flanked by Muhammad Zaman Kiani of Punjab and Abid Hassan from Hyderabad. When we came to the temple, Abid Hassan remembered, I found it filled to capacity with the uniforms of the INA officers and men and the black caps of South Indian Muslims glaringly evident. He had this to say about Netaji's speech. The memory I retain is one of an invigorating music, as that of a symphony dedicated to the unity of the motherland. That music sustained him during his travails on the battlefield. The political impact of Netaji's Army of Liberation in the winter of 1945-46 was best captured by Dilip Kumar Roy, who vividly described how Subhash's suddenly amplified figure added to the romance of an Indian national army marching, singing to Delhi, galvanized a frustrated nation out of its torpor and substantially damaged the insulation of the Indian army from the magnetic currents of popular enthusiasm for immediate independence. The winning of freedom presented two very different challenges in the sphere of music. First, what might be the best way of presenting the subcontinent's musical culture to the world? Second, how could musical conversations within the subcontinent continue in the aftermath of partition and the establishment of separate, often rival, post-colonial nation-states? In 1953, Dilip Kumar Roy toured Japan, the United States, and Europe as India's cultural ambassador. In Japan, he visited Renkoji, the Buddhist temple, where the mortal remains of his friend were kept. His performance in Tokyo was warmly received, even though he echoed Tagore's view that Japan's cultural accomplishments were more in the domain of the visual rather than the oral. On reaching the west coast of the United States, he enchanted his listeners at Stanford University with his expositions of the ragas Malkos, Jhijit, and of course Bhairavi, which he likened to the ancient Greek Phrygian mode. I mentioned at the outset that he opened his concert at the Asian Academy with Dhanodhanno. He closed with Bande Mataram, to which his disciple Indira Devi danced. As he prepared to travel to the East Coast, Aldous Huxley wrote to the head of the Columbia Recording Company. This is to introduce Mr. Dilip Kumar Roy, one of the greatest musicians of modern India. He is to be in New York during April, and while he is there, I hope very much you will take the opportunity, or you will seize the opportunity to record some of his own and some of the traditional music which he sings with such extraordinary power and expressiveness. The musician of modern India had a triumphant tour of New York, Philadelphia, and Washington before traveling to Britain, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and Egypt. What is striking are the musical pieces that elicited the most enthusiastic response from diverse audiences. For example, the reception of his recital of a Shibnam Kirtan composed by his father, Dijendralal, at the inauguration of a trade fair in Washington, attended by 3,000 people, warmed the singer's heart. The words were by no means simple. Bhutanath bhabo bhimo bibhala bibhuti bhushana trishul dhari bhujango bhairav bishana bhishon proshanto shankar shashanochari. Dilip rendered it in his self-composed Arana Raga in the Dhrupad style and won over the audience. The vigor of this song had been extolled by Aldous Huxley in Hollywood and would be praised by Bertrand Russell in England. In the academic setting of the University of Göttingen, Dilip's opening gambit with his father's Jedin Shunilo Jalodhi Hoite Uthile Janoni Bharatabarsho paid huge dividends. He began with the Bengali original, followed by Sri Aurobindo's English translation, his own Sanskrit version, and finally, his friend Professor Helmut von Glasenapp's German translation, which struck an immediate chord with the audience. The crossover of Raga Imon Bhupali in the Dhrupad style into a German song preserving the same meter as in the Bengali original was no mean achievement. Dilip had left Delhi on January 8, 1953. Once he landed in Bombay on August 27th, he could only sing to himself, "Amon deshti kothao khunje pabe na tumi, shakol desher rani seje amar janmobhumi." India's cultural diplomacy in revolutionary China required a somewhat different set of musical selections, and this is especially for Nirupama. On July 26, 1953, at 8 in the evening, the curtains lifted for a cultural performance by a visiting Indian delegation in Beijing's Hoping Peace Hall. The Indians began by singing in chorus Bande Mataram, the famous ode to their motherland. The patriotic prelude was followed by an overture to their hosts as Debobrata Bishwash of Bengal and Surinder Kaur of Punjab sang in duet Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, composed by Harindranath Chattopadhyay in celebration of the brotherhood of Indians and Chinese. Among the large audience was the top leadership of the People's Republic of China, with Chairman Mao Zedong in his trademark blue coat sitting unobtrusively in the fourth row. The penultimate item on the 20-course feast of Indian music and dance was a Bengali song poem written by Sukanta Bhattacharjee, a talented radical poet who had died young. As Debobrata Bishwash rendered the immortal lines of this inspiring song, "Bidroho aaj, bidroho charidike, rebellion today, rebellion everywhere," the young Chinese stage manager synchronized flashes of red light that enveloped the hall. The Prime Minister, Chu En-lai, hosted a grand banquet following the concert that had concluded with a Kathakali dance. "Aren't you the one who performed the revolutionary songs?" Chu En-lai asked Debobrata with a warm smile and a warmer handshake as he trooped into the banquet hall with his fellow artists. "Wonderful, wonderful. You must perform these songs wherever you go," Chu En-lai urged the Indian singer. From Beijing, the Indian delegation proceeded to Tianjin, where they visited the impressive Central Musical Conservatory. There, Debobrata Bishwash persuaded the sitar maestro, Vilayat Khan, to join him in presenting Tagore's popular song, Tomar Holo Shuru, Amar Holo Shara, that promised a beginning at every end. Vilayat's prelude and interlude in the Iman Raga took Biswas's vocal presentations to new heights. Debobrata commented that the fierce individualism of Indian classical musicians had been leavened by China's example of collective creativity. In Shanghai, a new element was added to the cultural performance, with Damayanti Joshi dancing to Debobrata's rendering of Tagore's Nrityero Tale Tale. "With the rhythm of your dance, O Nataraj, make me free from all bonds, wake me up from sleep, and let the rhythm of your bond-free song fill my heart." Debobrata titled the presentation Liberation of Man, and as anticipated, the Chinese audience roared their appreciation with calls for an encore. On the evening of August 15, 1953, as the Indians prepared to leave Shanghai for Hangzhou, a most astounding scene unfolded on the railway platform. A bunch of Chinese young men and women asked Debobrata Bishwash to sing Hindi Chini, and soon everyone joined in. What followed was a cyclonic dance with the Chinese and Indians holding hands. The classical vocalist, Master Krishnan from Bombay, slipped and fell, but that did not deter him from swaying to the rhythm of the song as he squatted on the platform. The laughter with which the song ended masked an emotional farewell, which became even more poignant as the Indians departed a few days later from Canton. On his flight back home, Debobrata Bishwash noticed tears flowing down the cheeks of Murthy, the mridangam player from Madras, as he looked wistfully out of the plane's window and his China diary lay open on his lap. A little over a decade later, I believe the same T.K. Murthy accompanied M.S. Subbalakshmi on the mridangam at her famous 1966 concert in the United Nations. The decision to include an English hymn written by Rajagopalachari in the program caused not a little consternation in Indian circles. However, the controversy was hushed into silence as the concert progressed. Those of us who have heard the recording of that memorable event cannot fail to be mesmerized by Matrim Bhajatha in Subbalakshmi's magical voice and the chant of Jaya Jaya Shankara, Hara Hara Shankara. On music's border-crossing possibilities in more recent times, I must rely, in conclusion, on my personal experience rather than any profound scholarly insight. For anyone bred in the tradition of Indian, especially Bengali music, it requires considerable effort to develop an ear for other musical traditions and forms. Even our window on Carnatic music was provided by Tagore's songs, such as Eki Labonne Purno Prano Pranesho He. I grew up in a musical environment, listening to my maternal grandfather playing the esraj and my mother the sitar. My mother had a beautiful singing voice and had been trained by the classical masters Girija Shankar Chakraborty and his disciple Tarapada Chakraborty. I first encountered Dilip Kumar Roy, who has served as my guide for today's lecture, in July 1963, when he presented an enthralling concert at Netaji Bhavan on Dijendra Lal's birth centenary. As a 6-year-old in the audience, I must confess that I was most taken by Dijendra Lal's martial song, Dhao Dhao Shamaro Khetre. Dhao dhao shamar khetre gaho ucche ran jaya gatha rakha karite pirit dharme shunayai dake bharat mata ke bal karibe prane maya jakhon bipanna janani jaya shaj shaj shakale ran shaje shun ghan ghan ran bheri baje চলো সমরে দিব জীবন ঢালি জয় মা ভারত জয় মা কালী. He also sang a beautiful ode to his friend Subhash. জানি না বন্ধু তোমায় কি নামে করব বরণ আমরা কীর্তি তোমার শুধু আজ করি স্মরণ. For my generation, Ravi Shankar and Yehudi Menuhin's West Meets East album, released in 1967, was a landmark event. I never had an opportunity to hear Ravi Shankar perform abroad. I first listened to him live when he gave a Netaji birthday concert on January 23rd, 1976 in Calcutta. He thrilled foreigners and locals alike by playing the ragas Shamakallan, Charukeshi, and Majkhambaj with Allah Rakha on the tabla, on the occasion of Netaji Research Bureau's second International Netaji Seminar that had featured none other than Dilip Kumar Roy earlier in the day in what was possibly his last public stage performance. It was only after going to Cambridge as a student in 1978 that I began to attend performances of Western music, ranging from the classical to jazz and African American soul. Outside India, it was also possible to become better acquainted with the music of other South Asian countries. We knew something of the musical accomplishments of Opar Bangla since 1971, but it was my visits to Bangladesh as a PhD student for research that gave me direct access to the way artists of Bangladesh had nurtured undivided Bengal's musical legacy. The partition of 1947 had divided the musical quite as much as the military assets of colonial India. Even among the popular playback singers of the Bombay film industry, we had Lata Mangeshkar, while Pakistan got Noor Jahan, who made just one heartwarming visit to India decades later. By the time I moved to the United States as a migrant intellectual laborer in the fall of 1984, the South Asian musician who was taking the West by storm was Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. It was not difficult for someone from the land of the Kirtan to be enchanted by Qawwali. My experience of a concert by Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan in the Lincoln Center of New York has remained forever etched in my memory. It began with an invocation of Allah, followed by an expression of devotion to the Prophet of Islam. Once the maestro launched into Akhiya Udik Diya, Dil Vaja Marda, Aja Pardesiya, Vasta e Pyarda, the entire audience erupted in applause. It was clear that in addition to Americans from all diverse backgrounds, the listeners included a large contingent from Punjab, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, for whom music breached the shadow lines of 1947. It is almost impossible to stop the flow of music, but it is possible for nation-states to obstruct the movement of musicians. For all the political troubles in Pakistan, that country seems to be having something of a musical renaissance. With prospects of live performances few and far between, the younger generation across borders tend to watch and enjoy the contemporary Coke Studio renditions of classical and folk music. While the hits produced in recent years have been many, my personal favorite remains Atif Aslam's version of Mai Ne Mai, both because of its creative blending of the musical strains of East and West and the evocation of the affective bond with Mother Punjab that cannot but appeal to anyone harboring a similar sentiment for Mother Bengal or Mother Tamil Nadu. It is probably for this reason that the Tamil version of A.R. Rahman's Bande Mataram, Thai Manne Vanakkam, somehow moves me more than his Hindustani version of 1997. And may I recommend Rahman's music track in Shyam Benegal's feature film on Netaji as a brilliant fusion of the music of Europe and South Asia. One way to enhance musical collaborations across the borders of the subcontinent is to decenter and weaken the nation-state's stranglehold on the domain of culture, to let the distinctive musical inheritances embedded in the different regions to flourish and cross-pollinate fresh creativity. The other is for South Asians in the global diaspora to come together to make music as is being done by the South Asian Symphony. For nearly 3 decades, Seiji Ozawa of Japan directed and conducted the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Attending his concerts in the late 20th century, I would often feel a trifle envious of the talented East Asian musicians who had risen to the pinnacle of Western classical music. By now, musicians of the South Asian diaspora have made European music their own, while drawing skillfully on the subcontinent's own contributions, as will be on display, I'm sure, this evening. Having reportedly declared to Edward Thompson that it was nonsense to say that music is a universal language, Rabindranath conveyed something more subtle to Romerola in 1926. The starting point for all arts, poetry, painting, or music is the breath, the rhythm which is inherent in the human body and which is the same everywhere and is therefore universal. I believe musicians must often be inspired by the rhythm of the circulation of blood or breath. Tagore undoubtedly believed, with Jalaluddin Rumi and other Sufi mystic poets, in the unity of light, the first element in the unity of creation. It was Rabindranath's commitment to a different universalism that led to this critic of narrow nationalism being embraced posthumously as the author of 2 national anthems and influencer of a 3rd. It is the celebration of that spirit of universality in the second verse of Jana Gana Mana, beyond the bounds of India's national anthem, that the peoples of all of South Asia, whether in the subcontinent or globally, need today. Aharaha tabo avhana pracharito, shuni tabo udaro bani. Hindu, Buddha, Sikh, Jaina, Parashik, Musalman, Krishtani. Purab, Paschim, Ashe, Tabo Singhasana Pashe, Prem Har Hai Gatha. The Azad Hind version went thus. सबके दिल में प्रीत बसाए तेरी मीठी वाणी हर सूबे के रहने वाले हर मजहब के प्राणी सब भेद और फर्क मिटा के सब गोद में तेरी आके Gunthe prem ki mala. It is only music which is capable of binding humanity with a garland of love. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for taking your time to enlighten us by that wonderful lecture. Once again, everyone, please put your hands together for Mr. Sugata Bose and for that fabulous lecture. I know that you all are waiting for the concert to begin. Before that, they might need some few more minutes to set up the instruments and everything. So by that time, it's my pleasure to welcome Ms. Nirupama Rao, founder, trustee of South Asian Symphony Foundation and Orchestra, to give us a brief introduction on South Asian Symphony Orchestra. Let's give her a warm welcome by a big round of applause. Ma'am, please. I request Ms. Niti Vashishta and Mr. Rabibul Alam to hand over the bouquet and ponada to Ms. Nirupama Rao.
Thank you, Sugata. Thank you for that wonderful lecture. You transported us beyond borders, as music should, and you combined your knowledge of history with your intimate interaction with many of the personalities that were involved in that epic struggle. So you brought home to us many home truths, I believe, on the power of music. Music, which is a basic human right of all of us across nations. You are going to hear musicians of the South Asian Symphony Orchestra this evening. I, together with my husband, Sudhakar, who is also here today, decided to go ahead with what I think was more of a dream, not really connected with the reality that we experienced around us, given the divisions that have kept us apart, particularly in our region of South Asia and even beyond. The world is a terribly complex place today, as we all know. All of us who experience the geopolitics of our time are aware of that. But I felt, especially in my retirement, that there was scope for what I refer to as citizen diplomacy, away from what governments do, what policymakers try and accomplish, and yet find difficult to do because we inherit divisions rather than overcome them. And that is the story of our lives. So we established a trust in Bangalore in 2018, and then I set about literally burrowing into the deep and dark beyond to try and see how we could find musicians of South Asia connected to the region and even those who lived beyond our borders, to bring them together to form a symphony orchestra. And I was asked earlier this evening by some of the students of the Asian College of Journalism, and I'd really like to thank the Asian College of Journalism and Mr. Shashi Kumar and the faculty and the students for making it possible to hold the first symphony lecture of the South Asian Symphony Foundation this evening, together with bringing to you this small concert of the South Asian Symphony Orchestra. Now, this orchestra has musicians, of course, with India at the core, because this is an Indian initiative. I often say this is India's South Asian Symphony. Because we, as a big nation in our region, I believe, have a special responsibility that devolves on us to seek to build unities despite the surrounding divisions. And I see that as a sacred responsibility of each and every one of us as Indians. So I set about literally burrowing, and as they say, if you dig deep enough, you come out at the other end of the world. As I did in New Zealand, we have a musician from New Zealand who is of South Asian origin. She's in fact our concert master for the Tchaikovsky string serenade that you will hear after this piece by the Woodwind Quintet, who are seated on the stage before you. And it's a fascinating story. I don't want to keep you too long. I don't want to separate you from the music. But we have musicians from India, from Sri Lanka, from Nepal. Unfortunately, we don't have our musicians from Afghanistan for this evening because, as you know, with the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, a lot of young musicians from Afghanistan had to flee the country, and those of them who were members of the orchestra for our previous concerts are now in Portugal as refugees. And they couldn't leave Portugal to come to the concert, despite the fact that we did give them visas, because there was no guarantee that they could return to Portugal to continue their refugee status, because things are still in a state of flux as far as their futures are concerned. I do hope that will settle down before long, and we will have them back at the next concert. And we, as I said, have a diverse group. We have members of the orchestra from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Singapore. Our conductor is Alvin Arumugam. Sugata, you spoke about Singapore and the Azad Hind government and the Indian National Army and Subhashji's own stay in Singapore. So Alvin Arumugam is a musician of Tamil origin, of mixed Sri Lankan and Indian forefathers, having gone to Singapore. And he conducts the orchestra. And as I said, we have this diverse group, and with each concert, they have bonded more and more closely together and formed the harmony that this orchestra has always sought to create, because that is I used the model of a South Asian, of a symphony, in order to demonstrate that strangers can come together, make music, understand the concept of harmony, and learn the art of listening, because as somebody said, the art of listening is like an act of love. It's when you listen to your counterpart or the person besides you that you begin to understand, that you begin to drop stereotypes and understand that there is a unity beyond division. The orchestra before you today, the quintet, begins with a piece by the Indian-American composer Reena Ismail. She's of Goan and I believe Pakistani parentage. They're going to perform a piece which Reena composed in 2017 called The Light is the Same. And I'd just like to read out a passage in which Reena speaks about what inspired her to write this piece of music. And she says it was inspired by Rumi, by the Sufi poet Rumi, and that essentially wherever men and women exist, whatever the divisions that may come between them, whatever their religions are, whatever their ethnicities are, they are one and the same. The light is the same. And that is really what this piece of music sets out to transmit to you. It is inspired by Indian ragas, but it also speaks to an international audience. The light is the same, and it will be followed by the Tchaikovsky String Serenade, which Tchaikovsky composed in 1880. It has 4 movements. It was a piece of music that he spoke of in very glowing terms, saying it elevated him, transported him literally to another sphere. And I hope our musicians will do the same when you listen to them. Ladies and gentlemen, the South Asian Symphony Orchestra. Thank you.
Yeah.
I request everyone to put your mobile phones on silent, and I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the conductor and music director of the orchestra, Mr. Alvin Arumugam, to receive our token of gratitude. So please, I request Nidhi Vashishta and Rabibul Alam to give them the ponada and bouquet. Once again, I request everyone to put your mobile phones on silent and enjoy. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.